The Delta Sky 217 was ready to depart from Atlanta. The sky was crystal clear, as if it carried the dreams of everyone on board. In the first-class cabin, a 17-year-old black girl named Leona Carter shyly took her seat 1A. It was the first flight of her life, heading to Boston for an interview for the prestigious Lighthaven Institute Engineering Scholarship. But before she could even savor that moment of pride, Leona was met with a pair of doubtful eyes and the cold voice of the head flight attendant. "Margaret Hale. Are you sure you're in the right seat, honey?" In that instant, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. If it were you being judged for the color of your skin, for how you look, how would you react? Would you get angry, stay silent, or hold your composure so you wouldn't be misunderstood? Leona chose the third option, but she had no idea that the man sitting right behind her was about to change not just this flight, but her entire life. Hit like, share, and subscribe to join us in this story where dignity confronts prejudice and justice takes flight. Morning in Atlanta. The sky was a shade of blue so clear it almost looked unreal. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass panels of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, glinting off the polished floor and touching the face of Leona Carter, a 17-year-old black girl standing in line, clutching her round-trip ticket with both hands. That ticket wasn't just a boarding pass to Boston. It was her ticket to rise above every doubt, every prejudice that had ever been placed upon her shoulders. Leona wore a simple white blouse, buttoned neatly all the way to the top as if even a tiny hint of carelessness might give someone an excuse to misjudge her. Next to her feet sat a small backpack. Inside were a notebook full of technical sketches, a few rough drone blueprints, and a letter from her father, Michael Carter, a mechanic who had spent his life believing that intelligence and integrity can take you farther than any engine ever could. "Remember what I told you, sweetheart," his voice still echoed in her mind. "You don't need to raise your voice to prove your worth. Just be brilliant and stay calm." Leona wasn't just flying north for a scholarship interview at the Lighthaven Institute of Technology. She was flying to prove that a girl from the working-class outskirts of the South could stand among the country's most promising young engineers. Her project, the Phoenix drone, was a compact prototype designed for autonomous navigation through heavy smoke, capable of assisting in rescue operations or delivering supplies to places unreachable by humans. 2 years of dedication, and now everything rested on this trip. At the security gate, a middle-aged white officer gave her the kind of look she knew too well not hostile, not overtly rude, but quietly skeptical. That tiny lift of an eyebrow, that cool nod that said, "You don't quite belong here, do you?" Leona had learned to breathe through the moments like that. "Stay calm," she reminded herself. "They expect you to lose your temper. Don't give them that victory." At the gate, the loudspeaker crackled. "Now boarding, Delta Sky, 217 nonstop service to Boston." Leona checked her ticket again. Seat 1A first class. For a moment, she thought it must have been a mistake. The scholarship had covered her travel, but first class. That felt unreal and, if she was honest, uncomfortable. She knew what people saw when a young black girl walked into a space like that: curiosity at best, judgment at worst. Stepping into the cabin was like crossing into another world, the scent of expensive perfume, the soft hum of business talk, the glow of laptop screens. A young flight attendant with kind eyes greeted her. "Hi there. You must be Leona. Right, here's your seat." "1A," said Emily Ross, her smile warm and genuine. It was such a small gesture, but to Leona, It felt golden, kindness real. Kindness always did. She set down her backpack, fastened her seatbelt. The seat was soft, the space serene, a world so far from where she'd grown up. In that quiet moment, she felt suspended between two realities: the modest home she came from and the future she was daring to reach for. Her mind drifted back to her father that morning, standing at their doorway in his faded work shirt, grease on his hands, but pride in his eyes. "You don't need to be anyone else. Leona, be yourself and always choose intellect over anger." Those words brought a faint smile to her lips, even as her heart pounded. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. Sunlight spilled across her open notebook. On the first page, written in pencil, were the words Project Phoenix Drone Multi-Layer Sensor Navigation, Swarm Behavior Simulation, and, underneath, a smaller note in her own handwriting: "No one is born to be limited." Leona had no idea how soon those words would be tested. She didn't yet know she'd soon meet Margaret Hale, the head flight attendant, a woman whose gaze could chill a room. She didn't know that just behind her seat, in 2A, sat Richard Davenport, vice president of an aerospace corporation, and a member of the very scholarship board she was flying to meet. All she knew was that this flight, what she thought was a simple trip to Boston, was about to become a test of character, patience, and dignity, a test of whether she could hold her head high when the world tried to make her feel small. Leona closed her eyes, inhaled deeply. Through the rising rumble of the engines, she could almost hear her father's voice again. "You can't control how people see you, but you can always control how you respond." The plane began to lift, pressure pressing gently against her chest. But inside her heart, there was no fear, only resolve. Somewhere above the clouds, Leona Carter didn't know it yet, but this was where her true journey would begin, where a young woman's dignity would be tested, and justice would find its wings. The Delta Sky 217 trembled gently as it left the runway, as if the whole world was sliding backward. Leona Carter opened her eyes, her mind still wrapped in a quiet, uneasy thought. She had taken off from Atlanta, but the looks, the whispers, and the quiet doubts she'd met at the airport still clung to her like a shadow. The door to first class closed with a soft click, sealing the cabin away from the rest of the plane. Everything here felt unfamiliar: the warm amber light, the soft clink of glasses, the faint scent of expensive perfume, the polished leather seats. It was peaceful, yet distant, like every passenger lived in their own little world, wrapped in the quiet comfort of privilege. Leona tugged lightly at her seatbelt, feeling the softness of the leather under her hand. She'd never sat in first class before. In fact, she could still remember the last time she'd flown, sitting in the very back of the plane with her father, near the restroom, the engines roaring the whole way. He had laughed and said, "As long as you're flying towards your dream, the seat doesn't matter, sweetheart." The memory made her smile, but almost immediately, a flicker of unease returned the sense that she was somewhere she didn't quite belong. She straightened her collar, folded her hands neatly, careful not to move too much, as if even a misplaced gesture might give someone reason to think she didn't fit here. A gentle voice broke her thoughts. "Hi there. Would you like some orange juice?" Emily Ross, the young flight attendant, stood beside her with a warm smile. Her eyes held no judgment, no hesitation, just simple kindness. "Yes, please." "Thank you," Leona replied softly. Emily poured the juice into a glass, set it carefully on the tray. If you need anything at all, just let me know. Leona. The way she said Leona's name naturally, respectfully caught the girl off guard. It was such a small thing, but to her, it meant everything. For once, she wasn't the young black girl who didn't belong in first class. She was simply Leona. "Thank you," she said again, her voice small but sincere. Emily smiled and walked away, her steps light, her presence leaving behind a quiet warmth that lingered even after she was gone. Leona looked around. A few rows of businessmen in tailored suits, a woman leafing through a financial newspaper, a man dozing behind a pair of noise-canceling headphones. No one seemed to notice her, and in a strange way, that was a relief. She opened her notebook, a faint ring of condensation marking the corner where her glass had rested. On the page was the sketch of her Phoenix drone, her dream in graphite and ink. Drawing calmed her. Every stroke was a small declaration. Keep going. Don't let their eyes define you. A few minutes of peace passed. Then a soft click, the cabin door opened again. A new voice, sharper, colder, sliced through the calm. "Excuse me. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Leona froze. Turning slowly, she saw Margaret Hale, the chief flight attendant. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup immaculate, her smile practiced, but her eyes told a different story. Suspicion, superiority, and the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. The air in the cabin shifted. The hum of the engines seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of Leona's heartbeat. Her orange juice trembled slightly in the glass. She took a breath. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "This is my seat, 1A." Margaret tilted her head, glancing down at the ticket in Leona's hand, then back up her gaze, sweeping the young girl from head to toe. 1A. There must be some sort of mix-up. Could I see your boarding pass and ID? Please, it wasn't a question. It was a test. Leona handed them over without a word. Margaret looked, nodded curtly, and gave them back with a tight smile. "Thank you. Just verifying something." But her eyes lingered, part apology, part disbelief, the kind of look Leona knew all too well. The look that said, "You don't belong here, even if the paper says you do." When Margaret walked away, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. No one spoke, but Leona could sense it, the quiet curiosity, the sideways glances from behind newspapers and screens. No words were needed. The message was already in the air. She sat still, hands folded in her lap. Her pulse slowed. Then she whispered to herself her father's words. "Stay calm. Leona, don't get angry. Your strength is in your mind, not your temper." She closed her eyes, letting the drone of the engines fill the space where her thoughts had been. She didn't know it yet, but this small, silent moment, her choice to remain calm rather than react, would become the spark that changed everything about this flight. The first-class cabin was peaceful again, at least on the surface, but beneath that quiet, something had shifted, something invisible, like the tension before a storm. And though Leona didn't know it, the man sitting just behind her, Richard Davenport, the vice president of the airline, had seen and heard every word. Leona thought it was over, that if she stayed calm, the moment would pass. But she didn't know that in just a few minutes. Margaret Hale would return, not just with suspicion, but with the false authority of someone who believed her uniform gave her the right to humiliate others outside. Delta Sky 217 cruised smoothly above a blanket of clouds. Inside, The air was about to thicken, and Leona Carter's dignity was about to face its hardest test yet. The hum of the engines was steady, almost like a lullaby in the sky. Leona Carter thought the awkward moment earlier had passed. She opened her notebook, jotting down some notes for the upcoming interview equations, key terms, a few reminders about posture and tone. Each stroke of the pen helped her breathe easier. Then came the faint scent of heavy perfume, followed by a voice behind her. "Sweetheart, I think there might be some kind of mistake." Leona looked up. Margaret Hale was standing there again, the chief flight attendant. But this time, the polite smile from before was gone. Her eyes were sharper, her posture more rigid, her presence colder. That practiced air of authority clung to her like a tailored uniform. Her gaze swept over Leona from the curls of her hair to the modest white blouse, down to her worn sneakers and the scuffed old backpack by her feet. "This seat 1A is usually reserved for first-class passengers," Margaret said smoothly. "Would you mind showing me your boarding pass again?" Her voice was sweet, but it carried the edge of a knife. Leona took a slow breath. She'd heard that tone before. That quiet disbelief wrapped in civility, the kind of voice that didn't call you out directly, but told you clearly you don't belong here. With a calm she had to reach deep for. Leona nodded. "Yes, of course." She handed over her ticket. The print was clear, seat 1A, first class. Margaret glanced at it once, twice, but didn't move. Instead, she leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to be overheard by the nearest passengers. "You know, sometimes our system upgrades people by mistake. It happens. You understand, right?" Leona felt it, that subtle shift in the cabin. Eyes turning toward her. Not with hostility, but with curiosity, the kind that prickles under the skin. Her pulse quickened, but her expression didn't change. "I understand," she said evenly, "but the seat was arranged by the institute that sponsored my trip." "It's correct." Margaret studied her a moment longer, then offered a small, brittle smile. "Well, I just wanted to make sure. We like to maintain certain standards in this cabin." The words landed softly, but they cut deep, a velvet dagger. From a few rows back, Emily Ross appeared, the young flight attendant from before. Her face showed quiet concern. "Ms. Hale, Leona's ticket is valid. I checked it when she boarded." Margaret turned slightly, her smile never faltering. "I'm aware, Emily, but we can't be too careful. Mistakes do happen. You're still new, you'll learn." Her tone lingered on. "You'll learn like a teacher correcting a child." Then she added, with just enough emphasis to sting, "The system can sometimes make people look out of place." Emily bit her lip but said nothing more. Leona met her eyes a small, grateful glance, then looked down at her glass of orange juice, half empty now, trembling slightly in her hand. No one spoke, but Leona could feel it, the stares, quick and discreet. A man in the seat 1C looked over briefly, frowning not at Margaret, but at her. It was the look of someone disturbed, as if her presence alone disrupted the quiet luxury of the cabin. Leona placed her glass carefully on the tray. Her fingers trembled, just a little. She could have defended herself. She could have reminded them all that she earned her place, that her brilliance had bought this seat long before any ticket did. But her father's voice echoed inside her. "They can take away your voice, but don't let them take your composure. The moment you lose your calm, they win." So she drew a breath deep, steady. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I'm fine right here. If necessary, I can contact the scholarship office for confirmation." Margaret paused, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Then, after a long beat, she said, "Very well, I just wanted to avoid any confusion," but as she turned away, she spoke loud enough for Emily to hear double-check the VIP list. "Please, we don't want another oversight." The cabin door closed behind her, and with it, the fragile piece in Leona's chest did too. For the rest of the flight, Leona couldn't focus. She tried reading her presentation again, but the words blurred. Every time she lifted her head, she caught a glance, quick, subtle, but heavy with the same question. What is she doing here? The golden light in the cabin felt colder now. The air was quieter, heavier. Leona leaned back, her reflection faint in the small window beside her. She wondered why it was so hard for some people to believe that a young black girl could simply belong no privilege, no exception, just belonging, and why others needed to build their dignity by stripping it from someone else. Outside, the clouds rolled endlessly, bright and white. Inside, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "It's okay. I don't need them to believe. I just need to keep going." The engines hummed on. The world below drifted farther away, but inside Leona, a quiet storm was forming, not anger, not hatred, just a growing strength waiting for its moment. Leona thought it would end there, that the humiliation had passed, and silence would take care of the rest. But Margaret Hale was not the kind of woman who walked away after her authority was quietly challenged, especially not by someone young, black, and too calm to be intimidated. In just a few minutes, as Leona tried to steady herself by sketching the final lines of her drone design, a small accident would occur, and from that moment on, nothing in first class would ever be quite the same. The first-class door opened once more, and Leona knew in that quiet, unmistakable way we sometimes sense before it happens that her brief peace was over. Margaret Hale returned, wearing the expression of someone just doing her job. In her hand was the airline's tablet, the corporate shield that turned suspicion into protocol. She walked down the aisle toward Leona, her voice carrying that same polished politeness seasoned travelers recognize instantly, the kind that sounds courteous but feels like a warning. "I'm so sorry to bother you again," Margaret began, "but it seems the system just flagged a small alert regarding an incorrect upgrade." Her words dripped with syrup, but the tone beneath was pure steel. Leona looked up, her face calm. An alert, she asked quietly, "I'm not sure I understand." Margaret tilted her head, the faintest, practiced smile on her lips. Sometimes, when tickets are issued through scholarships or sponsorships, there can be errors. To make sure everything's secure, I'll need to see your ID again. It's just procedure. Dear. The cabin went still. Nearby passengers pretended not to listen, but their curiosity filled the air. A man in the seat 1C lowered his Wall Street Journal, pretending to stretch his neck, eyes flicking toward them as if watching an unfolding scene. Leona could feel every glance pressing against her skin. She knew this feeling, the burden of having to prove you deserve to exist where others are simply assumed to belong. She reached calmly into her bag and handed over her ID. "Here you go. And yes, you've already seen my boarding pass." Margaret took the card, examined it once, twice longer than necessary, then, almost casually, she remarked, "Oh, South River District. Huh." The way she said it, the slight emphasis on South made it sound less like a fact and more like a judgment. a reminder that the address alone told her who Leona was supposed to be. Leona heard it, every layer of it, but she didn't flinch. "Yes," she said softly. "That's my home." Margaret smiled, a smile so tight it could cut glass. "All right, then. Just confirming, that's all. You understand procedures? We have to be cautious these days. Caution, procedure, words dressed up to hide what they really meant. Behind Leona," a woman whispered to her husband, "so young to be sitting up here." He didn't reply, just smirked faintly, eyes still on his tablet. Leona heard it all, but instead of anger, there was only that quiet, centered strength, the kind that comes from having been through this too many times to be surprised. And then, in her mind, her father's voice rose again, steady as the hum of the engines. "You don't have to raise your voice to prove anything. The way you stay calm, that's your loudest statement." Leona met Margaret's eyes and spoke, her tone low but clear. "Ms. Hale, I respect your procedures, but I'd appreciate the same respect in return no matter which seat I'm in." The words weren't loud, they didn't need to be. In the hushed air of the first-class cabin, they landed like a ripple on still water, impossible to ignore. For a moment, Margaret froze. Her polite mask slipped, just slightly. Leona caught at that flicker of discomfort, the crack in authority. Margaret wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone young, black, and unflinchingly composed. "Of course," she said quickly, voice too brisk now, "I'm only doing my duty." She turned to go, but not before addressing the nearby passengers in a tone half explanation, half performance. "We've had a few cases of ticket fraud lately, so we have to double-check these things. Thank you for your patience." A few chuckles murmured behind her, not cruel, but complicit, enough to make Leona's stomach tighten. She turned back toward the window. Outside, the clouds looked weightless, innocent, untouched by any of this. She watched them drift past, white against endless blue, and took a long breath. It wasn't the first time she'd been diminished this way. Back in high school, a teacher once looked over her drone design and asked, "Did you really make this yourself?" The question had sounded harmless, almost complimentary, but she'd felt the undertone then, too. The disbelief that brilliance could come from a girl who looked like her. Now, at 30,000 feet, the insult wore a new uniform, navy blue, gold stripes, and a badge of authority. It came dressed in smiles and policies, the kind of power that humiliates quietly, safely, with plausible deniability, from the galley. Emily Ross approached, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, are you okay?" Leona looked up, meeting her gentle eyes. "I'm fine," she said softly. Emily hesitated, then said what she really meant. Sometimes people forget that respect is part of the job. Leona smiled faintly. "You don't have to say anything. Emily, just being yourself, that's enough." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two women on opposite sides of a system that measured worth in uniforms and seats, quietly recognizing each other's humanity. When Emily left, Leona gathered her documents. She wiped her ID clean with a napkin, folded her boarding pass, and slipped them neatly into her notebook. And as she did, she realized something. Procedure wasn't about safety. It was about control, about power that needed to remind itself it still had some. Inside her chest, something shifted, not anger, but clarity. Her restraint wasn't weakness, it was strength. It was the proof that no uniform, no system, no seat number could define her worth. Leona believed that was the end of it, that once Margaret Hale had satisfied her sense of authority, the whispers would fade and peace would return. But fate, as always, had its own sense of irony. Just a few minutes later, as Leona bent over her sketches again, trying to lose herself in the lines of her design, a small accident would occur, a glass would spill, a hand would slip, or so it would seem, and in that moment, the quiet war between power and dignity would reach its breaking point. The first-class cabin of Delta Sky 217 was quiet, like a concert held under its breath. Even the steady thrum of the engines felt slower, as if the plane itself were waiting to see what would happen next. Leona Carter, 17 years old, sat upright with her hands resting lightly on her sketchbook. The words Phoenix, autonomous flight control prototype, still gleamed in ink that hadn't fully dried like her own dream of a machine that could fly on intelligence and belief. After a few minutes of silence, Margaret Hale, the chief flight attendant, returned. The polite smile on her face looked carved from stone, rigid, cold, deliberate. "Ms. Carter," she said softly, with a tone that bowed while looking down, "I do hope you won't cause us any more trouble. Up here, everything must follow procedure." Leona nodded, keeping her voice steady. "I understand, ma'am. I'm simply sitting in the seat printed on my ticket." Margaret didn't answer. She dipped her head, then stepped away. But when she came back to collect the glass, a small thing happened that felt heavier than the sky. She caught the edge of the carpet with her shoe. The tray in her hand tilted. The glass slid and spilled, and the cold water raced across Leona's tray table over her sketchbook, soaking page after page of delicate lines and careful notes. Ink bled outward, tearing through designs and calculations she had spent weeks perfecting, dissolving into gray, weeping strokes. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," Margaret said without meeting Leona's eyes, in a voice so falsely sweet it stung worse than an insult. "I can be so clumsy, please forgive me." No one in the cabin spoke. Leona sat motionless, watching as her notes were ruined. Her hand trembled not from the chill, but from a hurt. Only the humiliated truly understand the hurt of being diminished not by words, but by an act calculated to make you small. Emily Ross, the young flight attendant nearby, had seen everything. Her eyes widened for a beat, then drifted to Leona. "I'll help you clean this," Emily whispered, reaching for napkins in a hurry. Leona shook her head gently. "It's all right. I'll do it." But inside, her balance wobbled. All those days of effort, all those nights refining the model and listing each parameter washed away in a moment. She wanted to say something, to ask, "Why did you do that?" But the words caught in her throat. She remembered what her father told her before she boarded. When you walk into a place where other people's eyes might doubt you, remember, don't give them your anger. They'll use it against you. Hold your calm, Leona. You're strongest when no one can pull you down. His voice rose in her mind, clearer than the engines outside. Leona closed the sketchbook carefully and dabbed at the water with the small cloth from her bag. The cold seeped into her hands. Each smudged line felt like a piece of confidence being rubbed away. Still, she sat quietly, breathing evenly, saying nothing. Margaret glanced at her. Perhaps she was used to people flaring up, arguing, snapping, or crying to defend themselves. But Leona did none of that. No shouting, no tears. Only a young woman, calmly saving what she could of her work with a composure that made no sense to those who relied on power to provoke. and that composure no protest. No scene seemed to unsettle Margaret more than any outburst could. She turned away, a crooked smile on her lips, as if Leona's silence were an accusation only she could hear. The first-class cabin stayed hushed. A few other passengers began to pay attention. Among them, the man in seat 2A, silent since the beginning of the flight, tilted slightly to look. His eyes followed Leona's movements with purpose, not curiosity. Leona didn't know he was Richard Davenport, vice president of Aerolink, the very airline Margaret served. He saw it all, Margaret's careless bend, Leona's quiet control, the silence of the witnesses, a silence that was not innocent. As Emily discreetly handed Leona another napkin, she murmured, "She shouldn't have done that. I'll report it to my supervisor after we land." Leona shook her head. "There's no need. Sometimes the best way to resist is to let people speak through their own behavior." The words were soft, barely a breath, but they made Emily pause. She glimpsed something in Leona, then a kind of natural authority that doesn't come from a badge or a title, but from self-respect and steadiness. Leona closed the sketchbook and looked out the window. The clouds outside drifted, white and vast, close enough to touch, far enough to dream on. A sky that didn't ask who deserved to fly and who didn't. In that quiet hurt, something inside her shifted. Pain became fuel. Humiliation became resolve. And that silence, mistaken so often for weakness, hardened into a shell protecting the strongest part of her. No one in the cabin knew that the moment the water hit her pages was the pivot of the entire flight. A small act that split the path into one person slipping deeper into the arrogance of authority. Another beginning a climb powered by dignity. When Margaret left, trailing heavy perfume and the colder air, Leona shut her eyes. She told herself, "If they want to test me, fine. But they won't get my anger." She didn't know that. In the seat just behind her, Richard Davenport had folded his magazine, a hint of realization dawning in his gaze. Outside, the sky stayed calm. Inside, first class. Another wind was gathering, the wind of justice, of a coming shift in power about to rise in Part 6. Threats escalate. Water spread across the page like a wound that refused to heal. The careful ink lines of Leona Carter's drone sketch, each contour shaped by patience. Each note traced from the lessons her father once taught, blurred into gray streaks, fading beneath the cold spill. Margaret Hale stepped back, murmuring an apology that carried no weight. "Oh dear, how clumsy of me. I tripped on the carpet." Her tone was even, almost bored, like she'd dropped a napkin, not drowned someone's dream. Leona bent forward, lifting her sketchbook with both hands. Each movement was careful, deliberate, an instinct to save whatever could still be saved. Her fingers pressed paper towels to the edges, dabbing at the ink as though she were tending a fragile wound. Margaret stood above her, one hand resting on her hip. "Such a shame," she said smoothly. "You'll have to be more careful next time. Not everyone's used to the limited space up here." The words floated like perfume and stung like acid. "Not used to this space." The message couldn't have been clearer. "You don't belong here." The air tightened. A few passengers lowered their eyes, pretending to read, but curiosity flickered behind every page of their newspapers. Emily Ross, the young flight attendant, hurried over. "Let me help. Ms. Hale," she whispered, voice trembling slightly. She knew exactly what had just happened. Margaret lifted a hand, dismissing her. "No need. Emily, I've handled it." I'm sure our young passenger understands that accidents happen all the time. Leona looked up. Her eyes were calm, but the calm held a weight, the quiet kind that comes from deep pain. Yes, she said slowly, accidents happen, though not every accident is unintentional. Margaret's smile flickered. What are you implying? Leona drew a steady breath. Nothing, ma'am. Only that some mistakes come from carelessness and others from the way people see the world. The cabin seemed to freeze. Even the hum of the engines felt distant. A few passengers looked up, openly now. Emily's eyes widened with both fear and admiration. Margaret's face flushed red. She wasn't used to defiance, especially not from someone young, poised, and black. Are you trying to cause a problem? Leona met her gaze evenly. No, ma'am. I'm simply standing up for myself. Margaret crossed her arms. Stand up for yourself all you like. But if you continue with this attitude, I'll have to report you to the captain for disruptive behavior. 2 words, disruptive behavior, fell like a verdict. Leona froze. She knew exactly what that meant. One accusation could follow her long after the plane landed: detainment, questioning, suspicion, a permanent stain on a name she was still trying to build. And the irony was bitter, how easily power could turn innocence into threat. Emily stepped in. Ms. Hale, please, Leona hasn't done anything wrong. I saw enough. Emily, Margaret snapped. This is a security matter. I'll handle it. Leona turned slightly, giving Emily a small shake of her head. Don't. I'm fine. Then she faced Margaret again, her voice soft but sure. I don't want an argument. If you need to report something, do what you must. But please remember, I've stayed in my seat, followed every rule, and treated everyone here with respect. Her tone wasn't defiant. It was factual, dignified, precise. That very restraint disarmed Margaret for a moment. Her authority faltered, then returned like armor. Fine, she said coolly. I'll be sure to include that in my report when we land in Boston. We'll have to keep you for questioning. Leona didn't reply, not because she was afraid, but because she understood anything she said now could be twisted into proof of guilt. She closed the ruined notebook, laid it gently on her tray, and turned to the window. Outside, the clouds gleamed white against an endless sky so peaceful, so far from this small cruelty. But inside her chest, a storm churned, silent and fierce, not of rage, but of hurt, the ache of being misunderstood by those who refused to see. Margaret turned on her heel. The sharp rhythm of her heels on the cabin floor echoed through the stillness, a reminder of where power sat, at least for the moment. Emily placed a hand on Leona's shoulder. Don't let her shake you, she whispered. You've done everything right. Just hold steady. Leona managed a faint smile. You know, she said quietly, sometimes people wear authority the way others wear fear, like a coat they never learned to take off. Emily said nothing, but her eyes softened. She had seen it too many times, how uniforms could turn kindness into control, how protocol could hide cruelty. While Margaret made her internal call to report the situation, Leona sat in silence. Her hands folded together. She knew she was trapped in a delicate balance, one wrong word, one wrong look, and her entire future could unravel. And she also knew that was exactly what Margaret was counting on. Instead of anger, she closed her eyes and remembered her father's voice. People can insult you, but they can't decide who you are. Hold your center. That's where your real power lives. The memory steadied her. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse quieted. If they're waiting for me to lose control, she thought, they'll be waiting a long time. Leona didn't yet realize that just a few rows behind her, a man had been watching the entire scene. A quiet cough, a rustle of his magazine's small sounds that would soon change the air in the cabin. Richard Davenport, Seat 2A, Vice President of AeroLink, and a member of the Lighthaven Scholarship Board, had seen enough. And, in the moments to come, his voice would shatter the illusion of control that Margaret Hale wore so tightly. The engines roared softly on, steady and unaware, as the wheels of justice began to turn 30,000 feet above the ground. The click of Margaret Hale's heels faded down the aisle, leaving a heavy silence in first class. Leona Carter sat there, eyes on the small oval window, her heart balanced between pride and pain. She had kept her composure, but that composure pressed against her ribs like a tight fist. She didn't know that just behind her, in Seat 2A, the man who had been quietly reading had seen everything. He set his magazine down, removed his reading glasses, and turned his steady gaze toward the aisle where Margaret was re-entering the cabin. He was Richard Davenport, Executive Vice President at AeroLink, and a member of the Scholarship Board at the Lighthaven Institute of Technology, the very place Leona was flying to. It was a coincidence no one else recognized. He did. When Margaret came back, her face wore the cool confidence of someone who believed the situation was under control, that a word with the captain would be enough to put a special note in the flight report and teach a young passenger a lesson. But as she passed 2A, a low, clear voice stopped her. "Excuse me, Ms. Hale, I need a moment." Margaret froze. Her eyes flicked quickly, and her expression changed the instant she recognized him. "Mr. Davenport, I didn't realize you were on this flight." Her voice softened at once, tinged with a new uncertainty. Richard inclined his head, gaze steady and cool. "I didn't expect you to. I also don't expect you knew I've been observing you for some time." Margaret swallowed, her fingers tightening around the tablet. I'm just performing my duties." "Sir." "Your duties?" Richard lifted a brow. "Which part of your duties includes spilling water on a passenger's materials and threatening to report her for disruptive behavior?" The cabin fell silent. The hum of the engines, the whisper of the vents, the faint chime of the cabin systems, all of it seemed to vanish. Margaret stood rooted. A few passengers turned to look, openly now. Emily Ross, who had witnessed everything, stood still, hardly daring to breathe. Richard's voice dropped, not louder, but heavier. "Ms. Margaret Hale, I am Richard Davenport, Executive Vice President of AeroLink. I'll need your full name, employee ID, and today's duty details. I will personally report this to HR upon landing." Margaret's face went pale. "Sir, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "I know," he cut in, calm and unwavering. "There has been no misunderstanding. I saw it all. The way you singled out a passenger because of her skin color, the way you hid behind security procedures to justify humiliation, and now, this attempt to slide away from responsibility." Leona turned in her seat, stunned. A stranger, a man who didn't even know her name, had stood up for her. There was no pity in his eyes, only fairness. The sting in her chest shifted, her eyes prickled with heat. Margaret forced a smile, thin and uneven. I meant no discrimination. Sir, I was simply following policy. For everyone's safety, Richard's tone sharpened, not loud, but ringing clear enough for the cabin to hear. What policy permits you to degrade a paying customer? Which manual says a person in 1A must look like someone to deserve the seat? She had no answer. The air had weight now, a tension you could slice. Emily stood beside Leona, her hand trembling the first time she'd seen someone say out loud what everyone else only thought. Richard turned to Leona, and the iron in his voice gave way to something gentler. "Miss, were your materials badly damaged?" Leona answered softly. "Some of it, sir. But I'll be okay." "Okay." He shook his head. "You did nothing wrong. You don't have to say you're okay to excuse their conduct. They owe you an apology." He faced Margaret again. "I'm asking you to apologize to her here. Now." Margaret parted her lips, but the words stuck. Fear held one side of her throat. Shame held the other. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she managed, voice shaken. Richard folded his arms, measuring her. Inconvenience. That was not an inconvenience. It was an insult, and you will be held accountable. Then he nodded to Emily. "Ms. Ross, from this moment forward, you're in charge of first class. Ms. Hale is to step back from service for the remainder of the flight. I'll speak with the captain." Emily nodded, almost invisibly. Margaret stood in place, stunned, eyes vacant. The cabin was so quiet the pause itself felt like a verdict. Leona watched, emotions pulling in different directions. There was no joy in seeing someone fall, only relief. Relief that truth had finally been seen. And, more than that, she was moved by the way this man had named what she herself believed that dignity doesn't need to shout. It needs a voice at the right moment. Richard returned to his seat, his face softer now. "You're headed to Boston for a Lighthaven scholarship interview, aren't you?" Leona blinked. How did you know he smiled? "Just a little, because I'm one of the people who'll hear your presentation." Leona's eyes widened. For a heartbeat. Her pulse stopped. "You've already shown me something no technical skill alone can teach," he said, composure rooted in honor. "And that's something this world could use a lot more of." As the flight pressed on, the air in first class changed. Margaret vanished behind the service door, silent at last. Emily brought Leona a warm cloth and a fresh towel, and Richard, with a quiet courtesy, asked about the Phoenix project he'd glimpsed in her notebook. That conversation between a young woman who had been dismissed and a man with a say in her future opened a new chapter entirely. Because sometimes justice doesn't need to roar. It only needs to be spoken by the right person, at the right time. The air in the first-class cabin of Delta Sky 217 felt as thick as mist. No one spoke. No one moved. All eyes turned toward Richard Davenport in seat 2A, as he quietly took out his identification card, the AeroLink insignia gleaming under the cabin light, and placed it on the folding table in front of him. His voice was calm, measured, and steady, not loud, but clear enough that every word carried weight. "I'll be brief," he began, "because this isn't just about one passenger. It's about the integrity of this airline." He looked directly at Margaret Hale, who stood frozen near the aisle, her hands clasped tightly together. The color had drained from her face. The confidence that once fueled her tone had all but vanished. "Ms. Hale," Richard continued, "I've witnessed the entire situation. You profiled a passenger based on prejudice, abused your authority to intimidate her, and deliberately damaged her property. That's 3 serious violations: discrimination, misuse of authority, and destruction of a passenger's belongings. Margaret's lips parted as if to defend herself, but Richard raised a hand gently. "There's no need to explain. We have one guiding rule here: if you can't respect another human being, you don't deserve to wear this uniform." The cabin fell utterly still. A man in seat 1C gave a quiet nod. Another passenger looked up from his paper, relief softening his features. The silence had changed its shape. It was no longer indifference, but agreement. It was the collective exhale of people who had watched something wrong unfold and were finally seeing it named aloud. Emily Ross, the younger attendant, stood nearby, her eyes bright with emotion. She'd seen plenty of small injustices brushed aside because it was too much trouble, because it wasn't their business, but now she was witnessing the opposite justice spoken in a steady, human tone. Richard reached for the cabin intercom. His words were calm, but his tone left no room for doubt. "Captain Reynolds, this is Davenport in first class. I need you in the cabin immediately." Within minutes, Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit, a tall man in his 60s, hair silvered by years of flight, his presence quiet but commanding. He gave Richard a brief nod, one professional to another, but there was respect behind it. He knew exactly who was speaking. Richard spoke plainly. "Without drama, Captain. We have a serious breach of protocol and professional ethics. Chief Flight Attendant Hale is to be relieved of duty immediately. She'll relocate to the crew section for the remainder of the flight. Ms. Ross will assume control of first class." Reynolds nodded once. "Understood, sir." He turned to Margaret, his voice low but firm. "Ms. Hale, you know the procedure. Please come with me." Margaret tried to hold herself together as she unpinned her name badge. Her hands shook. When her eyes met Leona's, they no longer held disdain, only a complicated mix of shame and disbelief. I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Leona gave a small nod. She didn't need to hear more. Some apologies arrived too late to matter, but they still mark the beginning of awareness. When the door to the service galley closed behind Margaret, the cabin exhaled as if a weight had lifted. A few passengers let out soft sighs. Emily moved quickly, gathering the damp napkins and setting a fresh glass of water on Leona's tray. Her hands were steady now, her voice gentle. "You doing okay?" she asked quietly. Leona nodded. "Yes, for the first time. I feel like someone actually heard me." Richard smiled faintly, settling back into his seat. "And that," he said, "is exactly what every passenger deserves." He paused, studying her face. "You know, Leona, there are two kinds of power in this world: the power of position and the power of character. She chose the first and lost the second." Leona didn't speak, but her eyes shone the kind of light born not from triumph, but from relief, from gratitude, from finally being seen. Minutes later, Captain Reynolds returned to the cockpit. Emily began serving drinks again. The tension in the cabin softened, replaced by a quiet warmth. The man in seat 1D, older and gray-haired, leaned over slightly. "Young lady," he said gently, "I've been watching since the start. You handled yourself with grace, no shouting, no bitterness, just calm dignity. I wish more young people knew how powerful that can be." Leona smiled faintly, her eyes moist. "Thank you, sir. My father always told me, you don't prove dignity by how loud you speak." Richard, overhearing, nodded approvingly. He took a slow sip of coffee, then said, "You know, that calm you showed, that's what made justice possible. If you'd lost your temper, all they'd remember is a disruptive passenger, but you made them see the truth." Leona looked out the window. The sky outside was the same endless blue, serene, yet inside her something had changed. It wasn't anger anymore. It was strength, quiet, centered, renewed. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the bravest thing a person can choose. As Emily cleared the tray tables, Richard opened his laptop. Leona unfolded a dry napkin and began sketching again the shape of her drone. Phoenix, returning line by line from memory. Richard glanced over and smiled. "Starting over." "Yes," she said softly. "The original's ruined, but the idea's still here." She tapped her temple. He nodded. "Good. Paper can be destroyed, but dreams are built to survive." As the plane continued toward Boston, the sky outside seemed smoother, calmer, like the world itself had taken a breath. The turbulence was gone, but something deeper remained, a quiet understanding that connection can form in the unlikeliest of places. Richard glanced toward Leona, realizing their next conversation wouldn't just be about courtesy. It would open a new door, a real conversation between a girl who had been dismissed and a man with the power to offer her a future. And that moment would mark the beginning of the first-class cabin felt rinsed clean after a storm. Behind the service door, Margaret Hale had vanished, leaving a space where shame and justice had just passed each other in the aisle. But in the hush that followed, what settled in wasn't the memory of power on display. It was something simpler, sturdier dignity, restored softly, but without apology. Leona Carter sat still, both hands resting on her damp notebook. The smears on the page no longer stung as they had moments ago. They had become part of her story, now proof that some things can be damaged and replaced, while self-respect is what endures. Across from her, Richard Davenport set down his briefcase and leaned forward. There was no pity in his eyes, only regard. "Leona," he said evenly, on behalf of AeroLink, "I'm sorry, not only for what just happened, but for the other times seen or unseen when you may have been looked at and people saw something other than your talent and character." The cabin grew quieter, if that was possible. The apology was plain, without theater, without excuse, and it carried more weight for that very reason. Sometimes the right words, spoken by the right person, can rebuild more trust than any number of promises. Leona pressed her lips together, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. Before she could answer, Richard nodded toward Emily Ross. "Ms. Ross, would you bring her a fresh blanket and a tablet, if one's available? She needs a new place to keep working." Emily disappeared and returned a minute later with a pale blue blanket, soft, freshly laundered, and a small company tablet. "You can use this for now," she said gently, resting a hand on Leona's shoulder. "When we land, the airline will replace anything that was damaged. And thank you for keeping your composure. You made me proud." Leona's smile was unguarded this time. "Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Mr. Davenport. I just tried to do what was right." Richard's tone warmed, and sometimes that's all it takes, one person doing what's right to change an entire room. In seat 1D, a gray-haired man rose. Harold Bennett, a small tech CEO from Boston, spoke in a calm, measured voice. "I'd like to be on the record," he said. "I saw everything from the beginning. This young lady didn't cause any trouble. She was wronged. and the airline should know that too many of us have grown used to staying quiet when we see it. He turned to Leona. You remind me of my daughter. She's faced some of the same. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for a lot of other people. Too, a woman in 3B added softly. That's right. We all saw it. Thank you for staying so composed. I don't know that I could have. There were no applause lines, no dramatics, just small nods, quiet words, and the kind of respect that hangs in the air like morning coffee, warm, gentle, unmistakable. Leona looked around. The eyes that met hers were no longer appraising. They were companionable. She didn't try to speak. She simply inclined her head, a thank you, without the fuss of words. And in that moment, she understood dignity isn't something granted by others. It's what you keep, even in the worst moments. Richard Davenport addressed Captain Reynolds, who had stepped out briefly to confirm the disposition. Captain, please document the full incident. Security can receive it on arrival in Boston. I'll handle HR personally. Reynolds nodded, his gaze settling on Leona with a quiet respect. Miss, I'm sorry this happened on my flight. I also want to say you handled yourself like a leader. Leona smiled. I only did what my father taught me when someone tries to bring you low. Keep your head level and your heart clean. Reynolds returned the smile and headed back to the cockpit. The aircraft slid forward through steady air. Outside, sunlight brushed loose threads of cloud into thin, white ribbons. Inside, Leona unfolded the tablet, opened a blank page, and began to rebuild the Phoenix from memory. Her fingers trembled for a minute, then found their rhythm. Every line calmed her, the shape returning, the plan returning, she returning. Richard watched without intruding. The look in his eyes wasn't the scrutiny of an executive. It was the settled confidence of someone witnessing a young person reclaim what matters. When the frame of the drone took shape again, he spoke. I've seen a lot of candidates, Leona. It's rare to find brains and composure in equal measure. Today, you showed both. Skill is important, but character, that's what lasts. Leona looked up. Do you think what happened today will affect my interview? Richard's smile creased at the corners. It will, he said, in a way you might not expect. As the plane began its quiet descent toward Boston, late afternoon light gathered on Leona's face. The skyline formed beneath a thin lid of cloud. The harbor shining like a small coin in an open palm. Her chest felt lighter. She couldn't know that within hours 2 conference rooms would decide opposite futures, one for someone who had tried to live on borrowed authority, and one for a young woman whose intellect and integrity would carry her farther than any seat assignment ever could. That next piece of the journey where justice and transformation move from the cabin to the ground begins in the sunset poured into the first-class cabin, washing the floor in a soft gold light. Delta sky. 217 cruised quietly through the upper clouds, bound for Boston. After hours of tension, everything had eased. The only sounds were the hum of the engines and the faint rustle of pages as Leona Carter worked in silence. She sat by the window, the company tablet Emily Ross had given her resting on her lap. With a steady hand, she redrew the lines of her drone Phoenix, the project she had spent nearly 2 years building. Each stroke of her finger felt like a small breath of healing, as if she were reviving something that had just been hurt. Across from her, Richard Davenport watched quietly. He didn't interrupt, he just listened with his eyes. After a moment, he spoke. That's the drone you're presenting for the Lighthaven interview. isn't it?" Leona looked up, surprised. "Yes, sir. It's called Phoenix. Phoenix, the bird that rises again," he mused. "Does the name mean something special to you?" She smiled faintly. "It does. It's a symbol of rebirth, of starting over after everything's burned down. The phoenix doesn't end in ashes. It begins again from them." Richard leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the tray table. "Do you see yourself as the phoenix?" "Leona." She paused. The question wasn't mocking. It was thoughtful, a quiet test. After a few seconds, she said softly, "No, sir, but maybe today I learned not to let anyone else decide that I'm just ashes." He studied her for a moment, then smiled. "That's a very good answer." Richard signaled for Emily to bring 2 cups of tea. When she left, he turned back to Leona, his tone shifting no longer formal, but sincerely curious. "Tell me about Phoenix. What makes it different?" Leona sat straighter. The hesitation that had colored her earlier words melted away. Turning the tablet toward him, she sketched a few quick lines. "Phoenix is a drone prototype that can read real airflow patterns and adjust its wings in response, not just follow GPS routes. It uses aerodynamic sensors linked to terrain recognition cameras." Her eyes brightened as she spoke. "The idea started with my dad. He's a mechanic, never went to college, but he taught me how to listen to machines. He said every machine has a language. You just have to be patient enough to hear it." Richard nodded, clearly intrigued. "And you turned his wisdom into science." Leona smiled. "I just tried to connect 2 worlds, his intuition and my algorithms. Phoenix is that bridge, part hands, part mind, part craft, part dream." He chuckled softly. "I like that. No pretense, no showmanship, just truth." A warm quiet fell between them. Outside, the sky deepened to violet. Leona looked out the window. "You know," she said, "I almost canceled my interview after what happened earlier. I thought maybe I didn't belong in a place like Lighthaven. But then I realized if I stayed silent, I'd be proving them right." Richard set down his cup. "And I'm very glad you didn't." He leaned back, thoughtful. "You know, in 30 years in this industry, I've met many intelligent people, but very few who can stay composed under pressure the way you did today. Intelligence can earn success, Leona, but composure earns respect." Her breath caught a little, not because she didn't understand, but because it echoed something her father used to say: "Don't let anyone see you lose yourself, even when they try to break you. If you stay steady, you've already won." After a moment, Richard pulled a napkin from the tea tray and placed it between them. "Let's say your interview starts right now. No model, no tablet, just this napkin and a pen. Convince me Phoenix is worth believing in." Leona's smile widened. The doubt was gone now. She picked up the pen and began to draw. Each line was quick, confident, alive. "Here's the self-adjusting wing. When it meets strong wind, it doesn't resist, it shifts its angle to use that energy. Like people, sometimes you don't fight the wind, you learn to turn with it." Richard nodded slowly, watching her work. "And this," she continued, "is the terrain sensor. It learns from data, but more importantly, it learns from mistakes. I want my drone to make errors so it can fly better next time. Because everyone fails. What matters is that we keep flying." Richard's smile deepened, almost proud. "Leona, you're not just teaching aerodynamics, you're teaching the world about resilience." She looked up, eyes glistening. "It's just something I learned from my dad." Silence again, but a good silence, the kind that feels full instead of empty. The cabin lights glowed softly, catching the reflection in her eyes that earlier had carried anxiety, now clear with belief. Richard watched her a long time before he spoke, his voice quiet, reflective. I used to think success came from perseverance, but I've learned it also comes from kindness, from keeping your humanity in a world that forgets it. Leona smiled gently. And sometimes that kindness changes how people see you. They exchanged a look, no longer a witness and a victim, but two people aligned by truth. At 30,000 feet, something rare had taken shape, a bridge between justice and empathy, built not by confrontation, but by understanding. When the cabin speaker chimed, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Boston in 10 minutes." Leona exhaled softly, glancing down at the napkin still covered in her sketches. She couldn't know that within hours, 2 rooms in 2 very different buildings would decide 2 very different futures. One for the person who had abused her authority, and one for the young woman who had been underestimated, who would soon earn one of the most prestigious scholarships in the country. But for now, as the plane dipped toward the glowing city, Leona thought of just one thing: that calm doesn't just protect you, it helps others believe in what's good again. And that belief would carry into the captain's warm baritone came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our approach to Boston Logan International. Please fasten your seat belts. Thank you for flying with us," wind whispered along the fuselage. The aircraft tilted, a great bird searching for its perch. Leona Carter lifted her gaze to the sliver of late light slipping through the oval window, a gentle glow she'd never seen look so beautiful. Everyone has a flight that changes their life. For her, it was this one. Richard Davenport leaned over with a small smile. "Ready for tomorrow," Leona answered, her voice still a touch unsteady. "More than ever, sir." He nodded. "Good. Sometimes how we face a moment matters more than the result itself." Rubber-kissed runway, a soft thrum spread through the cabin, and with it came a wash of relief and anticipation. A few passengers glanced toward Leona and offered quiet smiles. She returned them not with dramatic gratitude, but with the small nod of someone who had just walked through fire and kept herself intact. When the cabin door opened, Captain Reynolds stepped out, voice firm yet kind. "Ms. Carter, Mr. Davenport Corporate has received the report. Security and management are waiting at the jet bridge to take statements. You'll both be driven to separate hotels to rest. We'll continue in the morning." Leona hesitated. She wasn't afraid, only struck by how an entire system was now moving because of something that had started with a look. Richard rose, picked up his case, and turned to her. "Come on, Leona. We still have a few things to do, not to punish, but to put things right." Cold Boston air slipped into the jet bridge. It was busier than usual. 2 airline managers and an airport security officer waited near the door. One manager stepped forward, dipping his head to Richard. "Mr. Davenport, Captain Reynolds briefed us. The temporary suspension of Chief Attendant Hale is in effect. She's being asked to remain for the investigation." Richard nodded. "Good. I want full statements from Ms. Ross and passengers in 1D and 1C. And make sure the first-class cabin cameras are securely preserved." "Yes, sir," the manager said. "Already arranged." Leona stood nearby, taking it in. No sharp voices now, no skeptical stares, only people following procedure, this time to protect her rather than question her. Another staffer approached, tone gentle. "Ms. Carter, we've arranged transport to the Aurora Hotel, near MIT. The airline will cover all expenses, and we offer our sincerest apologies." Leona blinked. "Thank you, but I'm all right. You don't have to." Richard smiled. "Accept it. Leona, it isn't a privilege, it's the respect you're owed." Then Margaret Hale emerged with two managers beside her. The old certainty was gone. The uniform that once looked crisp now hung heavy. As she passed Leona, she bowed her head, her voice so small it nearly disappeared. "I'm sorry for everything." Leona met her eyes not with hatred, but with a steadiness that felt larger than the moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I hope you'll remember today not for me, but for yourself." Margaret's eyes shimmered. She lowered her head and walked on, vanishing down the corridor. Richard watched her go and murmured, "Nobody wins here, Leona. Some people learn the lesson, some don't." Leona nodded. "I only hope that the next time she meets someone like me, she chooses differently." Beyond the checkpoint, a company car waited. Boston's evening was deepening into blue, the city lights beginning to stir. In the back seat, Leona watched buildings slip by. She said nothing, though she smiled when a sign reading "Welcome to Boston" flickered across the glass and into her eyes. Beside her, Richard tapped out a few messages. "The disciplinary process starts tonight," he said. "Ms. Hale will be grounded until the investigation is complete. Statements will be recorded. We'll make sure justice doesn't end at the aircraft door." Leona was quiet, then asked softly, "Do you hate her?" Richard gave the smallest smile, though his eyes stayed thoughtful. "No, I don't hate anyone, but I can't allow people like her to think authority is something you use to humiliate others." The words settled over her. She understood real justice isn't born from rage. It's held steady by those calm enough to keep it standing. At the Aurora Hotel, Richard turned to her before she stepped out. "Do you want me to arrange someone to accompany you tomorrow?" Leona's eyes shone under the streetlights. "No, sir. I think I can fly on my own." He chuckled softly and nodded. "I don't doubt that. But for what it's worth, I'm still in your corner." Leona gripped her bag strap and bowed her head slightly. "I won't let you down." Richard watched her cross the lobby. In that moment, he knew he had witnessed something rare, a person reclaiming dignity, not with power, but with self-possession. Boston's night air held a crisp edge. High above, another departing jet drew a thin line of light across the dark. Leona looked up and thought, maybe every flight carries a story. And sometimes, the story isn't just about where you land, it's about who you are when the wheels touch down. The next morning, 2 meetings would unfold at the same hour. At MIT, Leona would walk into her interview steadied by more than ambition, by the quiet conviction that composure is a form of courage. At AeroLink headquarters, a hearing would convene and Margaret Hale would face the consequences of her choices. 2 rooms, 2 outcomes, 1 message. Dignity does not lose to borrowed power. Morning settled over Boston, cool, crisp, and touched with the hush of new light. Sunlight spilled down the damp streets like a thin golden veil. And somewhere within that same moment, in 2 very different corners of the city, 2 people who once stood on opposite sides of a single story were waiting outside 2 separate rooms each, about to face their own reckoning. On one side sat Leona Carter, 17 years old, standing outside the interview hall of the Lighthaven Institute of Technology Lit. On the other was Margaret Hale, 45, waiting in the disciplinary hearing room at Aerolink Airlines headquarters. 2 rooms, 2 lights. One warm with opportunity, the other cold with consequence. At lit. Leona stepped into the interview room. It was small, but bright morning sun pouring through the glass panes, cutting across the polished table where 3 interviewers sat. In the middle was Richard Davenport, though today. He sat not as the airline executive, but as a member of the scholarship board. Leona gave a polite nod, her smile measured but steady. "Good morning. My name is Leona Carter, applicant for the Davenport STEM Scholarship." One of the panelists, Professor Allison Park, leaned forward. "Miss Carter, we've reviewed your file. Impressive work. But what I want to know is, in a world still full of prejudice, how do you manage to stay calm?" It wasn't an easy question, especially for someone who had lived that question only the day before. Leona took a slow breath and answered, her voice soft but firm. "Professor, I don't think calm means being unhurt. It means choosing how to respond. If I let others define my worth through their bias, I'll always be their victim. But if I respond with ability, with competence, I turn that bias into the ground I stand on." For a moment, the room was silent. Professor Park tilted her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. "That answer," she said quietly, "shows not only intelligence but character." Richard Davenport glanced at Leona, giving the smallest nod. In his eyes was no longer the scrutiny of an evaluator, but the quiet trust of someone who'd seen her truth. Another interviewer spoke up. "Can you explain the scientific idea behind your Phoenix project in the simplest way possible?" Leona smiled. She reached into her pocket and unfolded a crumpled napkin, the very same one she had drawn on during the flight. The faint lines were still visible. "Phoenix is a drone that knows how to listen," she said. "When it meets strong winds, it doesn't fight them. It adjusts its wings to use that force to fly farther. It learns from its errors instead of falling because of them." Professor Park chuckled gently. "And I assume that's your philosophy in life as well." Leona nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I believe every person, no matter their color, gender, or background, can go farther if they learn to adjust instead of resist." The room seemed to soften. One panelist nodded, another smiled. The interview ended not with applause, but with the quiet grace of mutual respect. As Leona stepped out, Richard said softly as she passed, "I told you, Leona, they'd believe you." At the same time, across the city at Aerolink headquarters, the hearing room was sealed and sterile. No sunlight, just the hard white glow of overhead lights falling on the table where Margaret Hale sat, hands clasped tightly together. Across from her sat the Vice Director of Human Resources, 2 corporate lawyers, and Emily Ross, the young flight attendant from yesterday. The HR officer spoke evenly. "Hale, we've reviewed the cabin footage. Your actions toward passenger Leona Carter are classified as gross misconduct, a serious breach of ethics and anti-discrimination policy. Would you like to make a statement?" Margaret's eyes dropped to her hands that once held trays and smiles with practiced ease, now trembling slightly. I didn't mean to hurt her," she said, voice thin. I thought she was in the wrong seat." Her throat tightened. "I've done this job for over 20 years. I'm not a bad person." Emily Ross leaned forward gently. Her eyes were kind, but unwavering. "Margaret," she said softly. "I know you're not a bad person, but yesterday you let prejudice speak louder than reason, and that hurt someone." Margaret looked up, eyes glistening. "You don't understand the pressure. Emily, the longer you serve, the more they expect you to keep order, but I see it now. Order isn't the same as justice." The HR officer closed the file. "We've also received 4 prior complaints about similar behavior within the past 2 years. The company cannot overlook this. Your employment will be terminated effective immediately." Margaret didn't argue. She simply stared at the small nameplate on the table, M. Hale, Senior Flight Attendant. When she finally rose to leave, she paused in the hallway, looking up at the large framed photo on the wall. Flight attendants smiling, hands over their hearts, beneath the company's slogan, "Respect is the sky we all share." She gave a small, broken laugh, one that carried both regret and recognition. Meanwhile, across town at Lit, Leona opened her email later that afternoon. "Congratulations, Ms. Carter. The board has chosen you as the recipient of the Davenport STEM Full Scholarship. Reason, outstanding ability, creative vision, and moral integrity." She read the last words twice, moral integrity. Her eyes filled, not from pride, but from peace. She whispered under her breath, "Dad, I did it." At a quiet cafe nearby, Richard Davenport received the same message from the board. Leona Carter, selected. He set his phone down and looked out the window. The Boston afternoon had turned gold. The wind played gently through the maple trees. He knew some flights last only a few hours, yet their echoes can alter a life, or even reshape how people understand justice and kindness. That evening, as Leona stepped out of the LIT campus, the sky burned in hues of amber and rose. She stopped, gazing upward at a plane gliding through the sunset, its silver body catching the last light of the day. She didn't know that the very same airline, Aerolink, had already begun drafting a new ethics training program, and that her story would become the first case study in that curriculum. As the last light of afternoon fell across the Charles River in Boston, Leona Carter sat in her hotel room, staring at an email from Aerolink Airlines. The subject line read, "Official Letter of Apology from the Aerolink Executive Board." She opened it slowly and began to read. "Dear Ms. Carter, on behalf of all Aerolink employees and the executive team, we extend our deepest apologies for what you experienced aboard Flight DL217 from Atlanta to Boston. The conduct of our staff member violated the core values our company stands for: respect, fairness, and human dignity. We take full responsibility and have taken appropriate disciplinary action. In addition, Aerolink will make a $10,000 donation to the Code, her foundation, a program that supports minority girls in technology education, in your name. We hope that from your story, together, we can begin a more positive change." At the bottom was the digital signature of Richard Davenport, Vice President of Aerolink. Leona finished reading and sat quietly for a while. It wasn't an overwhelming emotion that filled her, but rather a gentle calm, as if a circle had finally closed. A story that began in pain was ending with accountability. She smiled faintly and began typing her reply. "I don't need compensation. I only hope that other young women won't have to go through what I did. If my story helps someone be seen for who they truly are, then it was worth it." She hit send, then softly closed her laptop. The next morning, Aerolink announced a new program on its internal website, Respect in the Sky. dignity on every mile. Leona's story would become part of a mandatory ethics and empathy training module for all flight attendants and ground staff. In the introduction video, one sentence appeared on screen. Look carefully before you judge, because the person you dismiss today may be the one changing the world tomorrow. A short clip followed a moment taken from the hearing where Emily Ross, the young attendant who had stood up for Leona, said, "I learned that fairness doesn't happen on its own. It needs people who are willing to speak up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." That line became the central message of AeroLink's new training program, for her courage and integrity. Emily Ross was promoted earlier than expected. She was placed in AeroLink's Leadership Track program for employees showing strong potential and moral leadership. During a small internal ceremony, Richard addressed the staff. This promotion isn't just because Emily did the right thing, it's because she stayed kind when others stayed silent. Emily smiled and said simply, "I just thought, if I stayed quiet, I'd be standing on the side of injustice, and silence can be its own kind of complicity." The room erupted into gentle applause, not for heroism, but for the quiet power of a steady voice in a fearful crowd. As for Leona, the young woman once humiliated in first class, she was now preparing to begin her studies at Lighthaven Institute of Technology Lit. Along with the scholarship, she received a small envelope from AeroLink, a certificate for 50,000 air miles, and a handwritten note from Richard. For all the journeys ahead, Leona, use them to go wherever your dreams lead. Leona laughed softly. "I won't use them to go farther. Mr. Davenport," she said, "I'll use them to bring my father to Boston. He's never flown first class." Richard chuckled. "Then that will be the most meaningful flight of all." From Leona's story, the aftershocks reached far beyond what anyone expected. Media outlets picked it up not sensationally, but as proof that justice could be carried out with grace. On aviation forums, professionals discussed AeroLink's new implicit bias retraining program. Some flight attendants began posting publicly. Leona's story reminded me that every passenger deserves respect, no matter how they look or where they come from. One commenter wrote, "It's sad that justice often follows pain, but it's beautiful when, for once, the justice leaves something lasting behind." A week later, Leona received a package from AeroLink. Inside was a new notebook, its cover embossed with the image of the Phoenix drone, the symbol of her project, the one she had redrawn on that fateful flight. At the bottom corner, printed in fine gold letters, were the words dedicated to Leona Carter for proving that calm is the highest form of strength. Inside the front cover was a small card, a note from Emily Ross. "You reminded me why I chose this profession, not to serve those in first class, but to treat everyone with kindness." Leona placed the note gently on her desk and exhaled slowly. Warmth filled her chest. She realized that everything she had endured, every moment of pain and humiliation, had not been in vain, because sometimes a single event on a flight can change the culture of an entire company, even the way people see one another. That same afternoon, Richard Davenport entered the main conference room at AeroLink headquarters. On the large screen, the new training video was running. When it reached the segment of Leona's scholarship interview at Lit, he paused, watching her speak, poised, calm, articulate. For a moment, he said nothing. A colleague beside him asked, "Do you think that girl will go far?" Richard didn't look away. "No doubt," he replied quietly, "but more than that, she'll take others with her. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile forming. Maybe, for the first time in years, he felt something rare, that a single human mistake could open a much larger door to compassion. The following spring, Boston bloomed with cherry blossoms. Leona was now in her first year at Elliott, her life full of promise. Meanwhile, Margaret Hale, the woman who once looked down on her, was living through a very different season, one of reckoning and quiet regret. Their paths would cross again, not in anger, but in the bittersweet mirror of consequence. 6 months had passed since the incident. Spring had returned to Boston. The city glowed in soft sunlight. The cherry blossoms along the Charles River burst in full bloom. Amid the pink haze, a young woman stepped out of the glass building at the Light Haven Institute of Technology lit, her stride confident, eyes bright, a small model airplane in her hands. It was Leona Carter, the same young woman once humiliated aboard flight DL-217. But now, no one spoke of that day anymore. People knew her instead as the top first-year student in the automation engineering program, the only freshman selected to present her project. Phoenix, a self-stabilizing drone in dynamic aerodynamic environments at the National Student Science Conference. Beside her sat Richard Davenport, the special mentor for the scholarship program, listening carefully as Leona explained her updates during their regular meeting. Between them on the table lay the finalized Phoenix design and pages upon pages of Leona's handwritten notes. Richard leaned back in his chair, pride softening his tone. You know, Leona, sometimes we meet people who remind us why we still believe in the next generation. You're one of them. Leona smiled modestly. Thank you, sir. But maybe, if it hadn't been for that day, I wouldn't be here today. He nodded. Maybe so. Sometimes, it's adversity that sharpens who we are. A moment later, Leona opened her laptop and showed him an email. It was an internship offer from Aerolink's robotics division, the department that researched drone applications and aviation engineering. Mr. Davenport, she said, grinning. I just got selected for their summer internship at your company. Of all places, Richard looked at the screen, eyebrows raised, then chuckled. The world does have a way of coming full circle, and justice, if you give it time, always finds its way home. They both laughed. It wasn't just joy they shared. It was a quiet sense of peace, knowing that the past, no matter how painful, had become a foundation for what came next. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas, the afternoon light fell dully over a dusty street. Inside a small convenience store, the barcode scanner beeped steadily, beep, beep. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman in a pale gray uniform carefully folded grocery bags for customers. Her name tag read M. Hale. Yes, Margaret Hale, once the senior flight attendant of Aerolink, now worked the evening shift as a cashier at a local store. No one there knew she had once served elite passengers on a world-class airline. No one knew that less than a year ago. She had directed travelers in first class with authority and polish. Now, she was simply a tired woman, beads of sweat gathering on her forehead, the light in her eyes long dimmed. When the last customer left, she sat down on the worn chair and turned on the small TV behind the counter. The evening news anchor spoke in an upbeat tone. News from Boston first-year student Leona Carter, recipient of the Davenport STEM Scholarship, has been honored at the National Science Conference for her project, Phoenix. The screen showed Leona radiant in a white lab coat, holding her drone model, smiling under a storm of applause. At the bottom of the screen, a caption read from a regular passenger to a symbol of young American brilliance. Margaret froze. The pen in her hand stopped midair. That face, that name, she knew it instantly. The light from the TV washed over her features, revealing every line of age and regret. In her eyes flickered something that was both sorrow and shame. The broadcast continued. Leona Carter shared that she hopes her Phoenix project will be used in rescue operations and wildfire detection. She also plans to donate part of her scholarship funds to support STEM education programs for girls in underprivileged areas. Margaret dropped the pen and leaned back in her chair with a heavy sigh. A scene flashed in her mind that day in first class. Her own voice, cold and dismissive. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Now, the girl she had once looked down upon was being celebrated not for her background, but for her intellect and integrity. And she, the woman once proud of her authority and order, was counting change behind a counter in a corner store. She gave a faint, bitter laugh. "Maybe. This is what I deserve," she whispered. A regular customer came in and asked for another paper bag. Margaret stood, her practiced polite smile returning. Tired as she was, she remained courteous. Somewhere within her, a lesson had taken root: humility, learned late, but learned all the same, across the country. Leona stepped out of the award ceremony. The spring breeze played through her hair. Richard Davenport walked beside her, watching her with the quiet pride of a father figure. "See, Leona," he said softly, "sometimes the people who tried to hold you down are the very reason you rise higher." Leona smiled, her eyes gentle. "And thanks to them, I learned never to treat anyone the way they treated me." She looked up at the sky where an arrow-link jet cut across the clouds, leaving a white trail behind. It reminded her of that first flight, sitting in seat 1A, heart pounding as she endured suspicion and humiliation, but chose composure instead of anger. Now, whenever she looked at a plane, she no longer felt fear, only the quiet strength that comes from grace under pressure. Time can soften memories, but it never erases consequence, not the kind that punishes, but the kind that teaches. Every action, however small, echoes in someone else's life. On one side stood a young woman soaring high on intellect and compassion. On the other, a middle-aged woman learning humility in the absence of power. That afternoon, a light breeze drifted across the Lighthaven Institute of Technology quad. Leona sat alone on an old stone step. People hurried past in front of her, while the glass building behind her threw spring sunlight back into the air. She opened the notebook with the phoenix on the cover, the gift AeroLink sent after the incident, and began to write, "Everyone wants to fly high. But few realize that what keeps us aloft isn't wings, it's dignity." She paused, looking out. Across the sky, a plane was cutting through the clouds. The engine's distant hum faded, leaving a long white trail like a gentle reminder: every journey leaves a trace, no matter how small. Somewhere else, Plano, Texas, a small convenience store still burned bright after dusk. Margaret Hale had just ended her shift. She unclipped her name badge, slipped it into her bag, and sat on a plastic chair outside the store. The night wind felt cool on her face. She unlocked her old phone and scrolled the news. A photo popped up: Leona at the Young Innovators of the Year award ceremony. Leona, in a pale blue dress, stood at the podium and said, "I'm not here to recount anyone's mistakes. I'm here to remind us that we can all change and that good will find us if we're calm enough not to let anger decide our actions." Margaret set the phone down and looked up at the night sky. For the first time in months, she smiled no longer the tight, practiced smile, but the honest expression of someone who'd come full circle pride to fall, and then understanding. "That girl," she whispered. "She didn't just win scholarships, she won at being human." A few weeks later, Margaret began volunteering with a community job training program, helping young trainees with service communication skills. No one there knew her past. But whenever someone slipped into a disrespectful tone with a customer, she would quietly say, "You don't know who's standing in front of you. So choose respect. You'll never regret it." One evening, a student asked, "Miss Margaret, why do you always talk about dignity?" Margaret smiled, "Because I once lost mine, and it took a lifetime to learn that the authority of a uniform is nothing without the authority of character." Meanwhile, in Boston, Leona Carter stepped into a new season. She'd been invited to serve as a research assistant at Aerolink's robotics division under the supervision of an aerospace technologist. Richard Davenport still advised her, but now he was no longer just a guide, he had become a companion on the road. At their end-of-term conversation, Richard spoke in a warm, steady voice, touched with pride. "I've seen a lot of successful people, Leona, but few make me believe the world can be kinder. You're not only brilliant, you make others want to live better." Leona smiled, her eyes bright. "You taught me that, sir." "No, Leona." He shook his head. "I only witnessed it. You taught me that kindness isn't weakness. It's stronger than power." One early summer evening, Leona visited the Code Her Foundation, the organization that received the $10,000 donation in her name. She met girls black, white, Asian sitting at rows of well-worn computers. A shy girl asked, "Do people ever think we aren't good enough just because we're girls?" Leona leaned down, gently tapping a key on the child's keyboard. "They do. But it only becomes true if you believe them. If you believe in yourself, they'll have to change the way they see you." The girl smiled. Leona looked around and saw herself from 6 months earlier, afraid, hurt, yet quietly reaching upward. As sunset settled over Boston, Leona wrote a letter to her father, Michael Carter, back in Atlanta. "Dad, I understand now. Dignity isn't taught in school. It's learned in how we respond when we're treated unfairly. I didn't let them define me with contempt. I chose to show them my steadiness, and I think that's the only real way to win." She finished with a small line, "I love you. I'm flying. Dad only, this time. It's on a sky that belongs to me. And at the end of every journey, what lingers isn't the price paid or the punishment given. It's how justice answers us through transformation." The story between Leona and Margaret was never a stage play of winners and losers. It stands as proof that dignity will always outlast hollow authority. The weight of a uniform will never outweigh the weight of character. Karma doesn't have to be quick. It only has to be right. And it moves best when the right people step in at the right time. People like Richard Davenport, Emily Ross, and the passengers who chose to speak up instead of staying silent. In the end, Aerolink's training video played for a new class of flight attendants. A woman's voice came through. It was Leona. In a recent interview, "If someday you're given authority, remember, power isn't measured by how many people you can command, but by how many people you can treat fairly." The room fell quiet. A young attendant, barely in her 20s, whispered, She used to be a passenger. Now she's changing how we serve. Strange and beautiful. High above. Delta Sky 217, the same flight number as that fateful day, still takes off each morning. None of today's passengers know what once happened, but inside Aerolink's training system, and in the hearts of those who witnessed it, the lesson remains, a reminder that never grows old. Respect everyone, because you never know who's sitting in 1A. The story ends, but its echo carries on like engine noise fading into the wide sky. Wherever prejudice exists, awakening is needed. And wherever power gathers, compassion is needed even more to keep it from curdling into pride. Life, in many ways, is like a flight. Some people sit in first class, while others wait patiently at the back of the line. But your seat on the plane never defines your true worth. The story of Leona Carter, the young woman humiliated because of her skin color and background, reminds us that dignity doesn't need to be proven through anger. It's shown in how we carry ourselves in the face of injustice. When Leona chose calm over outrage, she didn't just protect herself, she made the world stop and reflect. Because grace under pressure is real strength, and kindness is what makes a person truly great. Meanwhile, the woman who once looked down on her learned the hard way that the authority of a uniform will never outweigh the authority of character. Our everyday lives are filled with flights like that, moments when we can hurt someone with a glance or warm their heart with a kind word. If each of us paused for just 1 second to choose respect over judgment, maybe this world would already be a gentler place. Thank you for watching today's story. If you believe that dignity, kindness, and justice are still worth spreading, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so, together, we can keep telling the stories that remind the human heart. Respect is the language we all share.